I'm Lucas, 30M, and a few weeks ago, something happened that flipped my entire world upside down. It started with an invitation that came out of nowhere, a wedding invitation from my ex, Olivia. To give a little background, Olivia and I dated for about a year, but that ended 3 years ago. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, no cheating or big arguments. We just drifted apart. Life got busy, and we lost touch. But every now and then I'd think back on those days. She had been important to me at one point, and even though I moved on, she was always a part of my past. So, when I got this invite, I was honestly shocked. We hadn't spoken since the breakup, and here she was, inviting me to her wedding. I sat on that invitation for a while, wondering if it was a good idea to go. I mean, it felt weird. But then, part of me thought maybe she was just trying to be nice, to keep things cordial. Maybe going would give me some closure or just let me see where life had taken her. I talked to my girlfriend, Emma, about it. She's amazing, by the way, and totally supportive. She encouraged me to go. What's the harm, she said. It's been 3 years you've moved on, and maybe this is just her way of showing there are no hard feelings. Still, something felt a little off. My parents, for one, were way too excited about this wedding. My mom had always adored Olivia, almost too much. When I told them about the invitation, they seemed to know more than they were letting on. They kept hinting that they'd stayed in touch with her, which I found odd. But they brushed it off, saying it was all friendly and no big deal. Looking back, maybe I should have seen the red flags there. Then there was my brother, Kyle. He's 25 and has always been the golden boy of the family. We were never close. He was the kind of kid who got all the attention. Straight A's, sports star, always in the spotlight. Meanwhile, I was the one who took a bit longer to figure things out. We've never really clashed, but we never had that brotherly bond people talk about. Recently, he'd moved to a different city for work, and we hadn't talked in months. In fact, when I mentioned the wedding to my parents, they kind of dodged talking about Kyle. Just one more thing that seemed a little off. The wedding was being held out of town, at this super fancy venue. That was strange in itself because Olivia had never been the type for extravagant things. When we were together, she was always about keeping things simple, dinners at small, cozy places, staying in and watching movies. So why this massive, over-the-top wedding? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided I was going to go. In the days leading up to it, I couldn't help but feel nostalgic. Memories of our time together started flooding back. It wasn't like I wanted to rekindle anything, but there were moments I'd catch myself thinking about what could have been. I even brought it up to a couple of my friends, and they all agreed it was odd that Olivia invited me. Why invite an ex to your wedding, one of them asked. It was a valid point, but I brushed it off. I figured Olivia and I had shared enough history that maybe she just wanted to show there were no hard feelings. Emma, though, started to act a little differently as the wedding got closer. She never outright said anything, but I could tell she wasn't thrilled about me going. I asked her if she wanted to come with me, but she declined. She said she didn't want to make it awkward for me, knowing Olivia would be there. I think we both knew that this wasn't just some casual wedding invitation, but neither of us could put our finger on why. The morning of the wedding, I got dressed, kissed Emma goodbye, and headed out. The drive to the venue was long, giving me way too much time to think. I kept wondering what Olivia had been up to these past few years, and how things had ended up this way. The road felt like it was dragging me towards something, but I wasn't sure what. When I arrived, the venue was stunning, way fancier than anything I could have ever pictured for Olivia. It was this grand estate with tall columns and sprawling gardens, the kind of place people dream of getting married at. Walking in, I felt out of place. Most of the guests were unfamiliar, except for a few mutual friends of Olivia and me, but even they seemed distant. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The atmosphere was almost too perfect, too polished, like everyone was in on some secret that I wasn't a part of. As I found my seat and waited for the ceremony to start, I kept looking around trying to figure out what was bothering me. And then, just before the music started and the bride was set to walk down the aisle, I saw him, the groom. It was Kyle, my younger brother. The room started spinning, and everything froze in place. Update 1. The second I saw Kyle walking down the aisle, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My younger brother, my own brother, was the groom at my ex's wedding, and no one had said a word. I was sitting there, frozen, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. It was like some twisted joke, but the more I looked at him, the more I realized this was very real. I could barely process it. How had Kyle, of all people, ended up with Olivia? And why hadn't he told me? Why hadn't anyone told me? Everything suddenly made sense. The weird behavior from my parents, the awkwardness in their responses when I mentioned Kyle, the extravagant wedding that didn't fit Olivia's style. It all came crashing together in that moment. As Kyle stood up front, waiting for Olivia, he scanned the crowd, and his eyes landed on me. There was a split second of recognition, his face went pale, and he quickly looked away, pretending he hadn't seen me. But that moment was enough. It was like we both knew we were standing on the edge of a ticking bomb. I couldn't move, couldn't react. My mind was racing, trying to piece together how this all went down behind my back. Did my parents know? Was everyone in on this? I felt like the last person to get clued in on the biggest secret of my life. The ceremony started, but I wasn't really there anymore. It was all a blur of vows and music, but my focus was locked on Kyle, wondering how he could keep something like this from me. I kept glancing at Olivia too, wondering how she went from being my girlfriend to standing here marrying my brother. The whole thing felt unreal. I had so many questions and no answers. At some point during the ceremony, I managed to grab my phone and text Emma. I typed out something like, "You won't believe this. Kyle is the groom." Her response came almost immediately. "That's insane." She told me to leave, but I couldn't. Not yet. I needed to see how this played out. I needed to understand how we'd all ended up here. The ceremony dragged on. Every word, every smile felt like a betrayal. I couldn't make sense of it, how Kyle, the brother I wasn't even close to, could do something like this without telling me. And Olivia, the person I spent a year with, she didn't think this was worth mentioning? The more I sat there, the more I felt a storm building inside me, but I kept it all down. I wasn't going to make a scene. Not here. Not now. Once the ceremony was over, everyone moved to the reception. I thought about leaving. I could just walk out, drive home, and forget this nightmare. But I didn't. I stayed. Part of me wanted answers, and part of me was just too numb to move. I hung around the fringes of the reception, watching people congratulate Kyle and Olivia, all while feeling completely out of place. It felt like everyone around me was in on the secret, and I was the odd one out. Kyle approached me first. He looked nervous, like he knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy. He came up to me with that sheepish, almost guilty expression, and I could see he was bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. I didn't say anything, just waited for him to speak. He stumbled through an explanation, saying things like, "It just happened and I didn't know how to tell you." The whole time, I just stared at him, barely holding it together. A part of me wanted to swing at him, but I kept my hands in my pockets, jaw clenched. Before I could say anything back, Olivia walked over. She looked apologetic, like she knew how bad this all looked. She started explaining how she and Kyle had gotten together after we broke up, how they didn't mean to hurt me, and how they were planning to tell me but never found the right time. I didn't even know how to respond. I just stood there, nodding, because what else could I do? The reception felt endless. My parents kept their distance, but I noticed how they avoided making eye contact with me. They knew. They had known this whole time, and they didn't bother telling me either. The anger was bubbling up, but I kept it bottled. This wasn't the place to explode, no matter how badly I wanted to. As the night went on and people started drinking more, I found myself feeling bolder. The alcohol was loosening up everyone else, and I could feel that pull to just blow it all up right there. I even thought about it for a second, calling Kyle and Olivia out in front of everyone, asking my parents how they could do this to me. But every time I got close to letting loose, Emma's texts would pop up on my phone. "Don't do anything you'll regret, just leave, babe. It's not worth it." I knew she was right, but it was hard to listen when all I wanted was to get some kind of resolution. By the time the night was winding down, I made a decision. I was going to confront Kyle and Olivia, but not in front of everyone. This wasn't the place for it. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching me lose it at their wedding. No, I'd talk to them later, privately, where they couldn't hide behind all these people. I needed answers, and I was going to get them. But for now, I walked away from the reception, headed back to my car, and drove home, the weight of everything sinking in. Update 2. After the wedding, I knew I couldn't just walk away from this without getting answers. I had sat through the ceremony and forced myself through part of the reception, but there was no way I could let it slide. The second the wedding festivities were winding down, I made my move. Kyle had been avoiding me most of the night, but I caught him just as he was heading toward the bar. I didn't care that it was his wedding day. I cornered him, not giving him a chance to run off or hide behind anyone else. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. I didn't need to ask much. He knew exactly why I was there, and the tension between us was thick. He tried to play it cool at first, acting like this was all just unfortunate timing. It wasn't the right time, he mumbled, shifting awkwardly, but I wasn't buying it. Not for a second. Before he could get any more excuses out, Olivia appeared out of nowhere, sensing the confrontation. She slid between us, trying to smooth things over like she always did when things got tense back when we were together. It was almost second nature for her. She pulled me aside, away from Kyle, and started explaining. I wasn't going to let them wriggle out of this that easily. I demanded answers. How long had this been going on and why had nobody told me? That's when Olivia laid it all out. According to her, she and Kyle had started dating about 6 months after we broke up. They had reconnected at a family event, one that I hadn't gone to, apparently. From there, things just happened. She talked about how they hadn't meant for it to get serious at first, but feelings developed, and it grew from there. I just stood there stunned. 6 months after we broke up, and nobody thought I should know. My own brother couldn't have the decency to tell me he was seeing my ex. Kyle stood there, silent, barely looking at me. When he finally spoke, it was weak. He said he was worried about how I'd react, so he kept it quiet. He said he didn't want to hurt me and was just waiting for the right time. The right time? We were standing at his wedding, and I was only finding out now. That was his excuse? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I couldn't hold it in any longer. I lashed out. How could both of them betray me like this? How could Kyle, of all people, stand there and act like he wasn't stabbing me in the back the entire time? I had been blindsided by the fact that they had kept this whole relationship hidden from me. And to top it off, they had planned this wedding behind my back as if I didn't matter. My anger flared, and I felt the betrayal from all sides, Olivia, Kyle, and even my parents. Speaking of which, that's when my focus shifted. If Kyle and Olivia had been together for this long, there was no way my parents didn't know. They had been acting weird for weeks leading up to this wedding, and now I understood why. I stormed off to find them. They were lingering by the side of the reception area, watching everything from a distance, trying to stay out of sight. They must have known what was coming. I confronted them right there. They looked uncomfortable, shuffling their feet and avoiding eye contact. My suspicions were confirmed. They had known all along. When I demanded to know why they hadn't told me, their reasoning was just as weak as Kyle's. They claimed they didn't want to upset me, that they were trying to protect me from the emotional pain. I couldn't believe it. They had kept this from me for over a year. and they thought hiding it was the way to go. It felt like a betrayal from every angle. Kyle was my brother, Olivia was someone I had once loved, and my parents, the people who were supposed to have my back, had kept this huge secret from me. Kyle tried to apologize again, stumbling through some half-hearted attempt at making things right, but I wasn't having it. I didn't want to hear it. I wasn't ready to forgive anything, especially not on that night. Not after everything had been thrown at me like this. I needed air. I stepped outside the venue, feeling like I was about to lose it. I pulled out my phone and texted Emma, telling her everything. She was just as shocked as I was. She didn't even have words at first, just told me to come home and get away from all of it. She knew this whole situation was toxic and was trying to protect me from doing something I'd regret. As much as I wanted to explode in front of everyone, I knew Emma was right. I couldn't blow up their wedding, even though they all deserved it. I took a deep breath and decided to leave quietly. I didn't say goodbye to anyone, didn't look back. I just got in my car and drove away. The questions were swirling in my head the whole time. How long had they all known? How could they let this happen without telling me? What was my relationship with my family going to look like after this? On the drive home, I started to seriously consider cutting Kyle and Olivia out of my life completely. Going no contact crossed my mind more than once. I didn't know if I could ever forgive them for hiding something this big from me and letting me find out in such a cruel way. That night, when I got home, I needed to vent. I opened Reddit and laid everything out in a long post, anonymously of course. I didn't name names, but I explained the whole situation in detail. The response was overwhelming. People were furious on my behalf, calling out the betrayal from every angle. They couldn't believe my family would do something like this. It was a strange sort of comfort to see so many people agree that what had happened was beyond messed up. The next day, my phone was blowing up with messages, support from random people, advice, and questions about what I was going to do next. It made me realize how universal this kind of betrayal felt to so many people. But I knew what my next step had to be. I needed to confront my parents directly, face to face. I had to understand why they had chosen to support Kyle and Olivia without even giving me a heads up. It wasn't going to be easy, but I couldn't move forward without getting answers from them. Update 3. A few days after the wedding, I knew I had to confront my parents. There was no way I could let everything go without getting some kind of explanation, so I arranged to meet them for dinner. The moment I walked into the restaurant, the tension was immediate. My parents were already seated, both of them looking anxious like they knew exactly what was coming. I could feel the unease in the air before I even sat down. They didn't waste any time. As soon as we were settled, my mom launched into her explanation, and my dad sat there, quiet, which wasn't surprising. He was never one for confrontation. My mom, on the other hand, was ready to defend their actions. She started talking about how they didn't have control over who Kyle and Olivia fell in love with. According to her, they were just trying to keep the peace in the family, and they didn't want to see either of their sons get hurt. Hearing that only made me angrier. Keep the peace. How was keeping this massive secret supposed to keep the peace? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I snapped back at them, pointing out that by hiding this from me, they had done the exact opposite. They had chosen Kyle's happiness over mine, and I couldn't understand how they thought that was okay. They watched me sit there, clueless at the wedding, blindsided by this betrayal, and they let it happen. My mom's defense quickly turned emotional. She started crying, saying that she didn't want to lose Kyle. She hinted at the fact that Kyle had been going through a rough time over the past year, and Olivia had been a big part of helping him through it. I guess they were afraid that if they told me about the relationship, it would have driven a wedge between us all, especially since Kyle was apparently in a fragile place. It wasn't like I wanted to dismiss my brother's struggles, but that didn't change the fact that they had all conspired to keep me in the dark. My dad, meanwhile, just sat there in silence, nodding occasionally. His lack of response only made things worse. It felt like he was silently siding with Kyle, like he had already made up his mind about whose feelings mattered more in this situation. It was infuriating, and the more they spoke, the more I felt like I was being boxed into a corner. My mom tried to make me feel guilty, playing up how hard things had been for Kyle, but that wasn't the point. The issue was the secrecy, the lies, and the fact that they had left me out of such a huge part of their lives. The conversation quickly took a turn when my parents started shifting the blame toward me. It was subtle at first, but they began hinting that maybe, if I hadn't distanced myself from Kyle, things wouldn't have been so complicated. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Now it was my fault. I sat there, stunned, as they tried to make it seem like I was the reason all of this had happened. That maybe if I had been closer to Kyle, I wouldn't have been so blindsided. That was the moment I hit my limit. I dropped the bombshell right there. I was seriously considering going no contact with all of them. My mom's face fell immediately. She started pleading with me not to do something so drastic. She kept saying that we were family and that no matter what had happened, we needed to stick together. But I wasn't sure anymore. The betrayal had cut deep, and it felt like no one had my back in all of this. After the dinner, I went straight home and posted an update on Reddit. The community was as outraged as I was. People were quick to point out that my family was gaslighting me, making excuses for their behavior, and essentially shifting the blame onto me for something they all should have owned up to. The support flooded in, with commenters calling out the manipulation and telling me I had every right to feel the way I did. I talked it over with Emma that night. She's been my rock through all of this, and I needed her perspective. She supported whatever decision I was leaning toward, but advised me to take some time before making a final call about going no contact. She didn't want me to make a permanent decision in the heat of the moment, which made sense. Still, part of me was ready to cut ties completely. A day later, Kyle reached out to me unexpectedly. He must have heard about the confrontation from my parents because his message came off as regretful. He wanted to talk, said that things had gotten way out of hand, and insisted he never meant for any of this to happen. I was reluctant, to say the least. I didn't know if I wanted to hear another round of excuses, but at the same time, I needed to hear what he had to say. So I agreed to meet him, even though I was wary of what he might try to pull. Heading into this meeting with Kyle, I wasn't sure what to expect. Was he going to apologize properly this time? Or was this just another attempt to justify everything that had gone down? Either way, I knew this would be the final confrontation. Whether we came out of it as brothers or completely estranged, I was ready to lay everything on the table. This time, I wasn't going to let him, or anyone else, talk me into thinking I was in the wrong. Update 4. I agreed to meet Kyle at a small coffee shop near the edge of town, a place far enough away that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. The tension was thick the moment I walked in. Kyle was already sitting at a table by the window, staring down at his phone. I sat down across from him, and for a minute, neither of us spoke. The weight of everything that had happened hung in the air, making it hard to even look at him. Kyle broke the silence first. He didn't waste any time and jumped straight into an apology. He told me that he regretted everything, how he handled things, how I had found out at the wedding, the whole mess. He admitted that he should have told me from the start, but he was afraid of how I'd react. He was scared the fallout would destroy our relationship. Hearing him say it out loud, the tension between us didn't ease, but at least we were getting somewhere. He then explained how it all happened with Olivia. After she and I broke up, apparently she was going through a tough time. She had been struggling emotionally, and Kyle had been there for her. They reconnected at a family event that I hadn't attended, and from there they started talking more. Kyle said they bonded over their shared struggles. He was going through his own rough patch at the time, something I hadn't even been aware of. One thing led to another, and eventually they started dating. Kyle admitted he had felt guilty the entire time. He said he knew it was wrong not to tell me, but every time he thought about coming clean, he chickened out. He wasn't sure how I'd take it, and the longer he waited, the harder it became. He said there were countless times when he almost told me, but fear kept holding him back. I could see the guilt on his face, but that didn't erase the betrayal I had felt standing at that wedding. I sat there, taking it all in. I wasn't ready to just forgive and forget, but hearing Kyle's side of things, it softened me a bit. I couldn't deny that he had been in a tough spot, too. That didn't excuse the secrecy or how things unfolded, but I could see where he was coming from, at least. As angry as I was, I also started to understand that it wasn't all black and white. Then Kyle dropped something I didn't expect. He opened up about his mental health. He confessed that during the time he and Olivia got together, he had been battling depression. He didn't go into too much detail, but he said that Olivia had been a huge support for him when he was at his lowest. She helped him through it, and that was part of why their relationship developed the way it did. Hearing this was a shock. Kyle had always seemed like the golden child, the one who had everything together. I had no idea he had been struggling like that. As he explained this, Kyle started to break down. He admitted something that hit me hard. He had always felt like he was living in my shadow. All this time I thought we were just different, that we didn't have much in common, but Kyle felt like he was always trying to live up to me. He said that while I had moved out, built a life for myself, and seemed confident in what I was doing, he was still trying to figure himself out. It was the first time I'd ever seen him this vulnerable. Hearing that made everything more complicated. I wanted to stay mad at him, but seeing my brother like this, admitting how he'd been struggling, it was hard to hold on to that anger. I couldn't just ignore what he had gone through. At the same time, though, I couldn't shake the betrayal. The way they'd kept everything from me, the way I found out, it still hurt. Kyle didn't try to justify what had happened. He asked for forgiveness, but he didn't push. He said he understood if I wasn't ready to forgive him yet. He just wanted to try and rebuild our relationship, but he left it in my hands. He was open to giving me space if that's what I needed. I left that meeting feeling conflicted. I wasn't sure if I was ready to forgive him. The pain was still fresh, and part of me wanted to hold on to it. But at the same time, hearing Kyle's side of the story made me realize that this was bigger than just the betrayal. There were things going on with him that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't an excuse, but it gave me a new perspective. Later that night, I updated Reddit. The community was split, just like I was. Some people thought Kyle deserved a chance at forgiveness, especially after opening up about his struggles. Others thought the betrayal was too deep and that I'd never be able to move past it. I could see both sides. The support from Reddit had helped me through this whole mess, but now I was facing a decision that no one else could make for me. Over the next few days, I spent a lot of time reflecting. I kept thinking about Kyle, about the years of distance between us, and whether it was possible to rebuild from here. Emma was by my side, offering support but not pushing me in any direction. She reminded me to take things slow, not to rush into forgiveness if I wasn't ready. But at the same time, she didn't want me to close the door on Kyle completely without thinking it through. I knew I had to make a decision soon. Either I'd try to rebuild things with Kyle, or I'd walk away from this mess for good. I wasn't sure what the right choice was yet, but one thing was clear: I needed to take control of the situation, no matter what. I posted one final update on Reddit, asking for advice one last time before making my decision. Whatever came next, I had to be sure it was the right move for me. Update 5. I knew it was time to make a final decision. After weeks of back and forth, meetings, and venting online, I had to figure out how I wanted to move forward with my family, especially with Kyle. I didn't want to rush into anything without thinking it through, but I also couldn't keep dragging this out forever. So I arranged one last meeting with Kyle to lay everything out on the table. When I called him to set up the meeting, I could hear the hesitation in his voice, but he agreed. We met at the same coffee shop where we had our last conversation, which somehow felt fitting. Kyle showed up looking nervous, like he knew this was it. Whatever I decided in this meeting would determine where our relationship stood from now on. As soon as we sat down, the tension kicked in again. Kyle didn't wait for me to start this time. He immediately apologized, again. He told me how deeply he regretted everything that had happened, how badly he wished he could go back and tell me from the start, and how he never meant to hurt me. This time, his apology felt more genuine. He didn't try to justify his actions, and he didn't push for immediate forgiveness. He just laid it all out, saying he understood that it would take time to rebuild trust. He made it clear that he was willing to do whatever it took to fix things between us. I listened, and I could see that he meant it. I didn't let him off the hook easily, though. I told him that while I understood his side of the story, the betrayal still cut deep. Rebuilding trust wasn't going to happen overnight. He would have to respect my boundaries, and things would need to be on my terms from now on. Kyle nodded, agreeing to whatever it took. I wasn't sure if I was ready to fully forgive him yet, but I was willing to try and move forward, slowly. The next step was confronting my parents. I arranged a separate meeting with them because I felt like they needed their own chance to explain themselves without Kyle there. We met at their house, and it felt strange walking in, knowing that the dynamic between us had changed so much. They were clearly anxious, but I could see that they were also ready to talk. My mom spoke first. She expressed her regret for how they handled everything. She admitted that they should have told me the truth from the beginning, but they were so focused on keeping the peace in the family that they lost sight of how it would affect me. My dad, usually the silent one, even chimed in, saying that they thought they were protecting me but now realized they had made things worse. It was the most accountability I'd seen from them throughout this entire situation. I didn't hold back, though. I told them how betrayed I had felt, how I had been left out of something huge that involved my own brother and ex. I told them that trust would take time to rebuild, and like with Kyle, things had to happen on my terms. They agreed, promising to do better moving forward, and asked for the chance to repair our family bond. I left that meeting feeling a little lighter, but I knew there was still a long road ahead. I decided to take some time to think about everything before making my final decision. Over the next few days, I reflected on how far things had come and how much support I had received from Reddit throughout the whole ordeal. It was surreal how much strangers on the internet had helped me process everything, and it made me realize that I wasn't alone in feeling betrayed by family. Their insights helped me see the bigger picture. Emma and I had one last conversation about everything. She reminded me that whatever decision I made had to be for my own peace of mind. She had been by my side the entire time, giving me space to figure things out, but always ready to offer advice when I needed it. Our relationship had grown stronger through all of this, and I knew I could rely on her no matter what. In the end, I made my decision. I was willing to try and rebuild my relationship with Kyle, but with strict boundaries. I would give him a chance to prove that he was committed to repairing our relationship, but I wasn't going to let my guard down easily. As for Olivia, I decided that cutting ties with her completely was the best thing for my mental health. There was no reason for us to stay in contact, and it was better for me to focus on healing. Over the next few months, Kyle put in the effort. He went to therapy, which showed me that he was serious about making things right. He respected the boundaries I had set, and slowly, I found myself starting to forgive him. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments where the hurt flared up, but I could see that we were making progress. My relationship with my parents also started to heal. They reached out more, trying to make up for the time we had lost. It wasn't perfect, and I was still cautious, but small steps were being made toward rebuilding trust. Emma continued to be my rock through it all. If it weren't for her, I don't think I could have navigated this mess as well as I did. Our relationship grew stronger as we worked through everything together, and I knew I could count on her no matter what came next. In my final Reddit update, I explained everything to the community. I told them about my decision to give my family a chance, the boundaries I had set, and how things were slowly improving. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, with many people praising me for taking control of the situation and making choices that were right for me. I closed that update with a sense of hope. I wasn't fully healed yet, but I could see the path forward. Trust would take time to rebuild, and there were still moments where the betrayal stung. But I was optimistic. With time, patience, and effort from everyone involved, I believed that things could get better. Hey everyone, so I'm a guy in my late 20s, single, and honestly, I've spent most of my adult life just trying to stay above water. After high school, I went straight into working low-paying jobs. College wasn't an option for me. I didn't want the debt, and it's not like anyone in my family had ever been able to foot that kind of bill. I've always been close to my family, we've got each other's backs. But there's one thing that always seems to cause problems: money. Not that we ever had much, but anytime there's been an opportunity for some, tensions flare up, especially with my siblings. So here's the big twist. I won the lottery. $5 million. Even typing that out still doesn't feel real. I've never won anything in my life, not even a scratch-off ticket. I bought this ticket on a whim, right after work on a Friday. I remember being at the gas station, counting out quarters for gas, and something just clicked. I threw down a few extra dollars, grabbed the ticket, and stuffed it in my glove compartment. Forgot about it until I found it a week later. I was already low-key laughing at myself when I scratched it. The numbers lined up, but it took a second for my brain to catch up. 5 million. The shock was unreal. I spent that entire night rechecking the ticket, going online, refreshing the page just to make sure it wasn't some kind of glitch. Now, I knew I couldn't let this win go to my head. I wanted to keep things quiet. I only told 2 of my closest friends, and they had 2 pieces of advice: don't tell anyone and get a financial advisor. So I kept quiet and scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor to get a grip on this whole situation. Walking into that office felt surreal, like stepping into someone else's life. The advisor laid out a plan, suggested a budget, and made it clear if I wanted to make this money last, I couldn't go wild. She gave me a pretty strict budget, suggested some solid investments, and told me to keep the money mostly untouchable, at least for a while. It all felt a bit intense, but I knew I had to be careful. With her advice in mind, the first thing I did was clear my own debts. They weren't massive, but for me, they'd always felt like chains. I had a couple of friends who had always been there for me during some rough times, so I quietly helped out with their small debts too. No big gifts, no flash, just enough to lighten the load. I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in years. After that, I couldn't put it off any longer. I had to tell my family. I sat my parents down one evening, trying to stay as calm as possible. Their reaction was about what I expected. They were ecstatic at first, obviously. But then, after a few minutes, my mom mentioned how much stress their mortgage had been causing, and my dad brought up their medical bills. Nothing too heavy-handed, but the hint was there. They didn't say it outright, but I could tell they were hoping I'd chip in. I didn't mind, but I also had a plan and wanted to stick to it. And then my brother, he's always been a bit of an eavesdropper, overheard. He walked in, and almost immediately, I could tell he was expecting something. I could see it in his face when he threw out a casual line about how it's great to have a family that can support each other, especially now. No specifics, but the message was clear. After that night, I started doing a lot of reading. I went down a rabbit hole of stories from lottery winners who'd ended up broke because they couldn't say no to their families or friends. It was a bit of a wake-up call. I read story after story of people who lost it all because of the pressure to help everyone. It was like getting a reality check before the real pressure had even started. When my parents brought up their bills again, I offered to cover a few of their immediate medical expenses. It wasn't what they'd been hinting at, but I thought it was a good middle ground. They didn't seem entirely happy with the limited offer, though. My mom sort of sighed and mentioned how lucky they were that I'd gotten this opportunity. It wasn't outright disappointment, but I could tell it didn't sit exactly right with them. The next week, my brother started dropping more hints about his own financial struggles. He's always been the type to make his problems loud in public, and he started doing it more and more whenever I was around. It wasn't long before he was making subtle comments about family loyalty and how everyone should look out for each other. It felt like a pretty heavy nudge in my direction. I tried talking to one of my friends about it, and he just said, "Look, you're going to have to set boundaries." He pointed out how quickly things could spiral, how people might start treating me differently. It was good advice, but it also hit me just how real this was all about to get. Soon enough, it felt like my family's behavior was shifting. My siblings seemed extra nice whenever I was around, offering to help with things they'd never cared about before. At the same time, they were acting distant, almost like they were tiptoeing around me, waiting for me to make some grand offer. The vibe was weird, and it kept me on edge. That's when I finally realized I needed to protect myself, to find a way to keep things in check before it spiraled. Just to be safe, I even went online and anonymously posted my situation, asking for advice. The replies were all pretty much the same: set boundaries, protect your money, and brace yourself, because once the requests start, they don't stop. It was a lot to take in, but I knew they were right. And so here I am, at the start of this crazy ride, just hoping I can hang on to my sanity and my winnings. Update 1. It all kicked off at a family dinner. It was supposed to be a casual gathering, nothing fancy, just my parents, my siblings, and me. I thought maybe we'd sit down, eat, talk about our week. I was hoping it'd be a nice break from all the weird vibes since they'd found out about my win. But right as we're sitting down, one of my siblings decides to casually bring up the lottery. He drops a comment along the lines of, family is all about supporting each other. Sharing is caring, right? The whole room goes dead silent, all eyes on me. I'm sitting there, not sure how to respond, but the way he said it made it clear he wasn't joking. It wasn't subtle, he was waiting for me to say something like, "Sure, here's a big chunk for everyone." But that wasn't happening. I tried to deflect, changing the topic, but the atmosphere stayed tense. After dinner, one by one, my siblings approached me privately, each with their own angle. One started with, "I just need a little help. Nothing big, think of it like a loan." The other played the sympathy card, talking about how hard things had been lately and how my win could really make a difference. It was like they'd rehearsed it. Each of them had an amount in mind, and they all called it a loan. But we all knew what that meant. Loans in our family aren't really loans. They're gifts that never get paid back. I tried to keep things calm, explaining that I had plans to invest the money and was sticking to a budget. I told them I wasn't planning on making any large gifts, that I had to think of my future too. But it was clear they weren't hearing any of it. They looked at me like I was some stranger, someone who'd suddenly lost touch with his roots. Later that night, my parents pulled me aside too. They didn't ask directly, but they hinted around the same thing. They mentioned how much everyone could benefit, how my win could give the family a better life. It was subtle, just like them, but I could tell they had expectations too. They weren't being as blunt as my siblings, but I could see the disappointment setting in when I didn't jump to say yes. The tension after that conversation was intense. The looks, the silence, the way everyone suddenly seemed so distant. My siblings made it pretty clear how they felt. They started accusing me of being selfish, saying I'd forgotten where I came from, that family should come first. I tried to explain again that this was a chance for me to secure my future, not something I could just hand out freely, but they didn't want to hear it. My parents didn't openly criticize me, but I could see it in their faces. They looked disappointed, almost like they were expecting me to come around if they gave me enough time. I left that dinner feeling like I was carrying a ton of weight, with everyone expecting me to fix their problems. When I got home, I was drained. I didn't want to keep feeling this way, so I went online and checked out some of those forums again. I read stories from people who'd gone through similar things, and most of the advice was the same: set boundaries, protect yourself. A few friends I confided in told me the same thing, saying I couldn't let the guilt pull me under. But it was easier said than done. After talking to a few more people, I realized I needed professional advice. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer to see if there was a way to protect my assets and create a bit of distance legally if things got worse. I hated that it had come to this, but it seemed like the only way forward. Around this time, things started blowing up on social media too. My siblings started posting vague statuses about betrayal and family loyalty. They didn't tag me, but it was clear who they were talking about. They made it sound like I'd turned my back on them, and I started getting messages from extended family asking what was going on. It felt like I was on trial without even having a chance to defend myself. I thought about giving in, maybe giving them a small amount to ease the tension. So I decided to send each of them a small, equal gift, something manageable. But instead of being grateful, they called it cheap, saying it was an insult. No matter what I did, it felt like it was never going to be enough. One night, I got an anonymous message. Someone, probably a distant relative, wrote that I was hoarding my wealth, that I'd forgotten my family. Reading that, I couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning, thinking about everything that had happened, trying to figure out how it had all gone so wrong so fast. The stress started taking a toll on me. I wasn't eating right, my sleep was terrible, and I felt constantly on edge. It was like my life had shifted overnight, and the people I thought I knew so well were turning into strangers. My phone was constantly buzzing with notifications, and each one felt like a weight pressing down on me. At this point, a friend decided to step in and give me a reality check. He told me I'd earned this money and had every right to protect it. He reminded me of how long I'd struggled, of everything I'd worked for, and that I didn't owe anyone a piece of it. It was reassuring to hear, but the tension with my family was something I couldn't ignore. I kept hoping things would die down, but it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. The messages, the vague social media posts, the constant pressure, it was unending. For the first time, I wondered if winning the lottery had been worth it at all. Update 2. After weeks of tension, my parents suggested a family meeting. They made it sound like it'd be a good chance for everyone to clear the air, for all of us to talk openly and reach some kind of understanding. I wasn't exactly thrilled, but I hoped it might help. Just in case things got too heated, I brought a close friend along for support. The moment my siblings saw him, I could tell they didn't like it, like I was bringing him back up, which honestly I kind of was. We sat down in my parents' living room, the setup feeling oddly formal. My parents were at one end, my siblings at the other. My friend and I sat on the opposite side, and the room felt divided before anyone even spoke a word. The silence hung there for a moment until my dad cleared his throat, and that's when the questions began. My siblings went right for it, wanting to know exactly how much I'd won, where the money was, and why I was hoarding it all instead of helping out. I decided to be transparent and pulled out some notes I'd prepared with a basic breakdown of my finances. I explained my budget, the investments I'd set up, and how most of the money was tied up to ensure it lasted. I made it clear that I didn't just have stacks of cash lying around waiting to be handed out, but instead of easing the tension, my explanation only seemed to make things worse. One of my siblings looked at me, unimpressed, and said I was acting like I was better than the family, like I was keeping secrets. The accusations started flying. They claimed I'd changed, that I was putting money above family, that I'd forgotten who helped me through tough times. It was like they had a list of grievances they'd been saving, and now was the perfect time to let them all out. My mom sat there quietly, looking uncomfortable, while my dad tried to diffuse things, saying that everyone just needed to understand each other. But then my mom chimed in, subtly siding with my siblings, suggesting I should consider helping out more, and that the money could really improve everyone's lives. It was clear that, to her, family should come first, and my reluctance to hand over cash made it look like I was abandoning them. At that moment, I had to question whether these family bonds could survive the stress this money had brought. It was a strange and sad realization. I looked around the room and barely recognized the people sitting there. They weren't happy for me, they were angry at me, and no amount of explaining seemed to change that. After hearing them out, I finally set my own boundaries. I told them directly that I couldn't and wouldn't give out large sums. I'd made up my mind, and while I loved them, I needed them to respect my decision. But as soon as I said it, my siblings reacted with anger. One of them gave me an ultimatum, saying they'd cut me off if I didn't reconsider helping them. Another started crying, talking about how I was betraying the family by refusing to share. Then they tried the nostalgia route, bringing up old memories of times when we'd all been close, stories of things we'd done together as kids, trying to make me feel like I owed them something because of our shared past. They even brought up small moments, times they'd helped me with little things, almost as if those moments were debts I was supposed to repay now. Eventually, my parents weighed in, trying to settle things. My dad reluctantly agreed to respect my choice, though I could tell he didn't entirely understand it. My mom, though, stayed mostly silent, her disappointment clear on her face. She didn't say it outright, but it was obvious she felt I was in the wrong for refusing. After that, things spiraled. My siblings started posting cryptic messages on social media about selfish family members and how some people forget where they come from. Extended family members and old family friends began chiming in, calling and messaging me, saying they'd heard I was refusing to help my family. I felt like my name was being dragged through the mud, and I was powerless to stop it. I went back to my lawyer, who advised me to take further steps to protect myself. He suggested that if things continued, I might need to legally limit family access to my accounts to avoid any future issues. It wasn't something I wanted to do, but after everything, it felt like a necessary precaution. As days passed, I started isolating myself more and more, pulling away from family events and gatherings. I didn't know who I could trust, and the constant pressure was exhausting. It was like every time I checked my phone, there was another message or notification reminding me of how my family felt. The people who were supposed to be closest to me had suddenly become distant, and I was left wondering if things would ever go back to normal. Luckily, my friends stuck by me through all of it. They kept reminding me that I was doing the right thing, that I shouldn't feel guilty for protecting my future. I leaned on them a lot during those weeks, realizing how much their support meant to me. And though I still felt guilty, I noticed something else creeping in: relief. By stepping back and setting those boundaries, I was finally free from the demands and guilt trips. For the first time, I felt like I was living my own life, without everyone else's expectations weighing me down. Update 3. Things took a darker turn, and I never expected my own family to go to the lengths they did. After that tense family meeting, I thought they'd give me some space, but the peace didn't last long. I started noticing things, small but strange changes in how my siblings acted around me, like they were always watching, waiting to hear if I'd changed my mind about the money. They started asking indirect questions, bringing up topics that felt like traps, prying about what I was spending or where I was investing. It was subtle at first, but enough to make me wary. Then, one of my siblings suddenly made some extravagant purchases: a new car, some high-end gadgets, clothes that looked far from cheap. It didn't add up. They'd been open about struggling with bills, yet here they were splurging. The thought hit me that maybe they were banking on my lottery winnings to bail them out eventually. I didn't say anything, but the suspicion stayed with me. Not long after that, I started hearing from friends who'd been contacted by distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years. Apparently, rumors were spreading, with some relatives claiming that I owed the family support. It was strange and frustrating to think that people I barely knew were talking about my personal finances. Then came the letters. They were unsigned, but I recognized some of the handwriting from old birthday cards. They mostly revolved around one topic: family. One after another, I'd get these notes in the mail, saying things like, "We should have a family reunion," or "Now that you're in a position to help, we hope you'll do what's right." Some were more direct, saying the family was disappointed and hoping I'd come around. It all seemed carefully designed to guilt trip me without making any direct demands. The tipping point was when one of my siblings hinted that they might share the story of my lottery win online. They didn't say it outright, but the suggestion was clear: if I didn't reconsider helping out, they'd make the whole thing public, maybe even twisting it to make me look like the villain. It was manipulative, and it felt like I was being cornered. My siblings started amping up the emotional manipulation, retelling old family stories with a twist that made me feel like I'd betrayed them by not giving in. Every conversation was carefully crafted to push my buttons, to make me feel like I was heartless for not stepping in. I started to dread seeing their names on my caller ID, wondering what tactic they'd use next to try and get a reaction out of me. At that point, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I contacted my lawyer again, and we worked on setting up even stronger security measures. I even installed a new security system at my place, half expecting someone might try to take matters further if they thought I wouldn't notice. My lawyer advised setting up financial guardrails too, putting a firm lock on any accounts and investments to prevent unauthorized access. He warned me that it wasn't unheard of for family members to try shady methods when money was involved. Sure enough, not long after that, I noticed some suspicious activity on one of my accounts. It was a small attempt, nothing major, but it raised a red flag. Someone had tried to access my financial information. I didn't have proof it was a family member, but it didn't feel like a coincidence. I took it as a sign that things had gone too far, and I couldn't keep ignoring the threat of what my own family might do. I finally decided to confront my siblings directly. I told them I was aware of what was going on, that I knew about the rumors, the threats, and the guilt trips. I made it clear that if they didn't respect my boundaries, I'd be forced to take legal action to protect myself. That didn't go over well. They exploded, accusing me of turning my back on family, saying I'd changed, that I'd become one of those rich people who didn't care about anyone else. After that confrontation, things reached a breaking point. They cut off communication with me completely, refusing to answer texts or calls. There was a strange mix of relief and sadness. I didn't want to lose my family, but I couldn't keep living under constant pressure and manipulation either. Feeling lost, I turned to Reddit for advice, posting anonymously about the whole ordeal. The responses poured in, with strangers offering their support, reminding me that I wasn't in the wrong. Reading the messages from people who had gone through similar situations or who simply understood made me feel a little less alone. I also started therapy, something I'd put off for too long. Talking through everything with a professional helped me process the guilt and betrayal. My therapist encouraged me to focus on building a life that was my own, to let go of the idea that I had to please everyone else. It was tough, but I realized I couldn't keep carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. As the days passed, I felt my resolve strengthen. I knew I had to live independently, free from the financial and emotional demands of others. With time, I started thinking more about what I wanted from life beyond my family. I began investing in myself, looking into new ventures, taking classes, and setting goals that had nothing to do with anyone else's plans or needs. This experience taught me that setting boundaries wasn't just about money, it was about choosing to protect my own peace and happiness. I'd always wanted to help my family, but not at the cost of my own well-being. For the first time, I was looking forward to a future where I could live without the constant pull of guilt and pressure, and that was something I wouldn't trade for anything. Update 4. I'd finally started to settle into a quieter life. After months of confrontations, accusations, and strained conversations, things had gone silent. It felt like I could finally breathe again. I was working on myself, trying to focus on things I enjoyed, like a new book or a jog around the neighborhood. For the first time in a long time, I was feeling some peace, but that peace didn't last. One morning, I got a call from my bank. They asked me to verify a substantial withdrawal request, a red flag immediately, because I hadn't touched that account since setting up my investments. They explained that someone had come into a local branch with documents, claiming to be me, trying to withdraw funds. The person had all the right information and even forged my signature. Luckily, the bank's security checks kicked in, and the request was flagged. I asked them to block any further transactions and to put a hold on my accounts while they investigated. I was shaken and confused. I didn't want to believe it, but everything pointed to one of my siblings. With everything that had happened, it wasn't a big leap to make, but the reality of it hit hard. My own family going this far? It felt like the final betrayal. I called my lawyer, and he didn't hesitate. He recommended pressing charges, or at the very least, filing a report to create a legal record of the incident. He warned that if I let this slide, there was a risk it could happen again. I didn't want to involve the authorities, but at this point, it felt like I had no choice. I had to protect myself, even if it meant stepping into territory that could damage my family ties permanently. When I confronted my sibling, they didn't just deny it, they turned the tables. They accused me of lying to keep all the money for myself, claiming that I was just trying to paint them as the villain to justify hoarding my wealth. They were adamant, saying it was my paranoia getting the best of me and making up stories. Before I knew it, word had spread through the family. Within hours, my phone was flooded with calls, texts, and angry messages from relatives, all siding with my sibling. My parents were devastated, caught in the middle of this storm. They didn't openly take sides, but my mom, as usual, gently suggested that I let it go for the sake of family peace. My dad was quieter, but I could sense he didn't entirely disagree. It felt like they'd rather keep the family together at any cost, even if it meant sweeping everything under the rug. After that, I couldn't hold back anymore. The pressure, the accusations, and the betrayal from my own family, it all broke me down. For the first time, I questioned if any of this was worth it. The lottery win had felt like a blessing, but now it was nothing but a curse, driving a wedge between me and the people I once trusted most. My lawyer urged me to take a strong stand, so I decided to file a restraining order against the sibling who tried to access my account. It was a drastic step, but I couldn't think of any other way to protect myself. When the news hit, the family exploded. The tension that had been simmering for months finally boiled over, and it was ugly. Almost immediately, my siblings and a few other relatives took to social media. They started posting cryptic messages and some not-so-subtle comments about selfish family members and how money changes people. It was a full-blown smear campaign, with accusations and insinuations that twisted the entire situation. People who didn't know the full story jumped in, commenting and sending me messages, asking why I wasn't helping my family or calling me heartless. Then came the calls and emails from extended family, family friends, even distant relatives who'd barely been in my life. Some were accusing, others were pleading, but all of them were siding with the family. My name was being dragged through the mud, and I felt isolated, like I was the villain of a story they'd all decided to believe. At that point, I cut off all communication. I stopped answering calls, muted messages, and didn't engage with the social media drama. The betrayal from people I'd trusted had taken its toll, and I needed to step back. Almost everyone I'd grown up with had turned against me, and I felt a deep sadness I couldn't shake. I began pulling back from almost everyone in my life, even beyond my family. I just didn't know who I could trust anymore. My therapist, who I'd been seeing regularly, was a lifeline. They advised me to establish even firmer boundaries, reminding me that I wasn't responsible for anyone's financial happiness but my own. I was constantly doubting myself, but those sessions helped me see that protecting myself didn't make me a bad person. Needing to vent, I turned to Reddit again, updating my followers on the situation. I shared the whole story, from the betrayal at the bank to the social media fallout and the isolation. The support was overwhelming. People reassured me that I was doing the right thing, that boundaries were necessary, and that I wasn't alone in facing family betrayal over money. Reading those comments lifted a weight off my shoulders, and I felt my resolve growing stronger. Cutting ties had left a huge gap in my life, but for the first time, I realized that the silence had its own kind of peace. Without the constant demands and guilt, I was finally free to focus on things I wanted. I threw myself into new hobbies, started exploring projects I'd always put off, and began to enjoy the financial freedom responsibly. I knew I'd lost a lot, but I hadn't lost myself. I wasn't living under anyone's expectations, and I could finally see a future where I wasn't defined by what my family thought or expected of me. Update 5. Months have passed, and life looks different now. For the first time, I've started living a life that feels like it's mine. Without the constant demands and guilt trips from my family, I'm focusing on things I'd always put off. I signed up for some classes I'd been curious about for years: photography, cooking, even a personal finance course. It's strange, but after everything, I wanted to learn how to manage money properly on my own terms. I also started traveling. Nothing extravagant, just short trips to places I'd always wanted to see. Standing on a beach as the sun rose, hiking through quiet trails, exploring new cities, these were experiences I'd only ever imagined. I wasn't spending wildly, instead, I made a careful budget and stayed well within it. For once, I was able to treat myself without feeling any weight on my shoulders. Of course, the quiet didn't last entirely. Word of my lottery win kept spreading through extended family and old acquaintances. Every so often, I'd get a message from a distant relative or an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. They'd reach out with a friendly, "How have you been?" That always circled back to, "Let's catch up or we should reconnect." But I could read between the lines, and I kept my responses polite but distant. There was no way I was opening the door to anyone with possible ulterior motives. One night I sat down to journal, just letting it all out on paper. I wrote about everything that had happened since the win, the family confrontations, the boundaries I had to set, and the trust that was shattered along the way. As I reflected, I realized that despite the pain, setting those boundaries was the best thing I'd ever done for myself. I'd finally taken control of my life, free from expectations I couldn't meet. Out of the blue, one of my estranged siblings reached out. They sent a text, apologizing, but in that half-hearted way that didn't feel like much of an apology. They said they understood things now, but still hinted that I should see things from their side. There was no real ownership, just a vague attempt at patching things up. I thought about responding, but in the end, I didn't. A simple message wasn't going to change what had happened, and I felt it was better to let that chapter close without reopening any old wounds. A few days later, I noticed a post from one of my parents on social media. It was a vague message, something about family and regret, with no names attached, but I knew it was meant for me. It seemed like a subtle, indirect apology for all the drama. I didn't respond, but I took it as a sign that maybe, over time, they were starting to see things differently. The support from my friends through everything had been a lifeline. Once things started calming down, I reconnected deeply with those who'd stuck by me from the start, the ones who never asked for anything and only wanted the best for me. We spent more time together, and I was reminded of what real support felt like. Their friendship helped me see the value of relationships that aren't built on expectation, but on mutual respect. Therapy played a big part in my journey too. Each session helped me let go of the guilt and lingering pain, allowing me to fully embrace my independence. My therapist encouraged me to continue focusing on building a life that was about me, not about what others wanted from me. With each session, I felt lighter, more in control. One thing I'd always wanted to do was give back, but for something meaningful to me, not just to appease family demands. So I decided to donate a portion of my lottery winnings to a charity I genuinely cared about. The decision brought me a happiness that money alone couldn't buy. Giving back in a way that wasn't forced or expected felt like a true gift to myself and others. In this fresh chapter of my life, I met new people who knew nothing about my financial situation. I enjoyed conversations that weren't tinged with money talk, people who saw me for who I was without any assumptions. Building connections without the weight of my family's demands was refreshing, and I found myself enjoying relationships in a way I hadn't in years. Eventually, I did reconnect with one of my parents, the one who hadn't been directly involved in the betrayals. We kept our relationship limited and respectful, only seeing each other occasionally, and avoided talking about the past. It wasn't the close family bond we once had, but it was something. Feeling that my journey had come full circle, I posted a final update on Reddit, thanking everyone who'd supported me through the ups and downs. I shared how setting boundaries with my family had taught me about strength and resilience, how it had allowed me to rebuild a life that wasn't about keeping others happy. I told them that my life was in a better place now, that I was finally free from the weight of everyone else's expectations. The response was incredible. People flooded the post with support, congratulations, and messages reminding me I'd made the right choices. It felt good to close that chapter with the knowledge that I wasn't alone, that others understood and supported the path I'd taken. Now, as I look toward the future, I feel at peace. The family drama may have been painful, but it led me to a place of strength and self-reliance that I wouldn't trade for anything. I'm ready to move forward, building a life that isn't defined by my family's expectations or the weight of anyone else's demands. It's a life that's finally my own,